Look, I'd like to begin this evening by just thanking Anne Mossop and her team at the Opera House here for working with Melbourne University and bringing this fabulous event to Sydney. I really have a deep faith that events like this are fundamentally important to our society. We're exposed to extraordinary ideas by the best people on the planet to talk about them. We take them in, we think about them, we talk to other people about them, and they do eventually change things. They're so important. So thank you to the Opera House and everyone involved in doing this. I'd like to devote my 25 minutes this evening to dealing with two great juggernauts. Many people would argue that they are the two juggernauts, great trends, that will determine our fate, that will determine whether we see the collapse of Western civilization or whether we transform into something more sustainable and more durable than we have at present. One of those trends I hardly ever talk about, population on the planet. I always get asked about it, but I very rarely talk about it up front. But I've realised that it actually is very important to talk about it. And talk about it in conjunction with climate change and with our changing technological base, the green revolution that is very swiftly sweeping through the energy sector globally. And I'll try to explain why I think those two things are so linked. But let's turn to the population issue first. For years and years, as I've been looking at population, I've been doing it through the lens of the United Nations biennial assessment, really, of where human population is going. And they've been saying for years now that there'll be something around about 9 billion people on the planet by 2050 and perhaps slowly growing. And that's probably, in a large ballpark sense, true. But what I've realised is that looking at the population issue just as that massive growth, adding 100 million people a year, a billion a decade, as we are at the moment, and then slowing towards 2050, is not all that useful. You can actually get a much better understanding of the challenge and the trends by looking at a few other factors. And one of the really important ones, I think, is what's called the total fertility rate for our species, Homo sapiens. It's really important because it embodies the ideal experience, I suppose, for women at a particular moment in time. Around the time I was born, the mid-1950s, the total fertility rate for women around the planet was about 5. That meant that the average woman had about 5 children. But as of the last 5-year period that the average fertility rate was measured, which is 2010 to 2015, the total fertility rate has dropped to 2.36. So it's more than halved in my lifetime. I find that quite an extraordinary figure. What's even more important, though, to understand is what the replacement rate is. So what is the ideal total fertility rate if we just want to replace our population? You may think it's 2, but it's not, because a lot of women in developing countries fail to reach reproductive age. There's still high mortality rates in many countries. In fact, the total replacement rate for our species at the moment is about 2.33. That is amazingly close to 2.36. We are almost at the replacement rate already. So why is the population growing? Why does it continue to grow? Partly it's a historical artefact. It's a result of the inertia in the population, that in past generations there was lots and lots of people having children. So there's lots of people now having fewer children, but the population is still growing. There's another trend, though, that we need to look at to really dig down and find out what's happening with our population, and that concerns gender imbalance. In two of the biggest populations around the planet, in India and China, there's been a strong preference in recent years, and perhaps historically, but been able to be expressed effectively in recent years, for males over females. I think we can all see that that's a tragic situation, but putting the morality aside, what impact does it have on overall population growth? Well, once you factor in gender imbalance and that population bulge or the overhang, as I mentioned, there's some demographers who are saying that we may reach replacement population rates globally as early as next decade. so as early as the 2020s. So population growth after that is going to be mostly about people just living longer. Now, having said that, I just want to emphasise that whatever the case about that, it is really, really worthwhile continuing to invest in the poorest countries, the poorest developing countries, to better the quality of life of women and men and children in those countries. Because if we do that, if we give people more economic autonomy, we give them more control over their own bodies, we know that results in smaller family size. In fact, for every 1% advance in GDP in countries around the planet, there's about 0.25% decline in total fertility. So that really, really does work, and it's important that we do that. But if I could just say, it is quite astonishing to me that this is happening at all. I mean, every other species that has ever existed on this planet has been subject to a Malthusian fate. Thomas Malthus said it, you know, that the reproduction goes up, I forget what, exponentially, food increases only arithmetically, populations crash. Ours is the only species ever in the history of the planet that is self-regulated, and we've done it astonishingly, species-wide across the planet, it looks like from these new figures, in around a century. So everyone has gone through the demographic transition in about a century. Why is it us, the intelligence of the planet, if you want, that has this very unique characteristic? It's sort of scary to me as a scientist. It's a bit like watching an eclipse to me, and I kind of ask, well, why does the moon fit right over the sun just like that? There's something kind of uncanny about it. Well, this whole idea of the demographic transition strikes me the same way. We, the intelligence of the planet, are the only self-regulating species that ever has existed. It looks like, if these latest figures are to be believed, our population will stabilise at around about 9 billion. Of course, feeding 9 to 10 billion people without using fossil fuels, as we know we'll have to do by 2050, seems like an impossible challenge. But I do really believe that there is hope in changing technologies that may allow us to do this. A week ago, I saw the most extraordinary thing here in this country, in South Australia. I went out to Port Augusta and had a look at a big complex of greenhouses out there called Sundrop Farms. And these greenhouses, they're built in the desert. You know, there's nothing much higher than my knee in terms of vegetation out there. There's no fresh water. It's on Gulf St Vincent, a very salty body of water. And yet, within a month or two, those greenhouses will be producing 10% of Australia's truss tomato crop. They're the ones you see in the supermarkets commonly, without the use of any fossil fuels and without the use of a drop of fresh water. It's incredible what's happening out there, the technological change that's happening. The greenhouses out there are run on the back of a huge solar farm, 4,000 panels reflecting sunlight onto a concentrator. That concentrator gathers the heat energy. It's used to desalinate salt water to provide water for the crops. It's used to generate heat and also cooling to keep the greenhouses at the right temperature. And it's used for electricity generation, for all of the things you need in a big greenhouse like that. The way the greenhouses are designed is such that pesticide use is really limited. There's hardly any, well, there's no tomatoes in the surrounding districts, so there's not many sources for pests into the crop, not like tomatoes grown around here or Melbourne or elsewhere. And the units are compartmentalised, so workers only work in one unit. They never go into another unit, so cross-contamination's controlled, hardly any pesticides used. It's really a closed system. It's quite astonishing to see this. I talked to some of the researchers out there. Those researchers think that this model is replicable wherever you've got sufficient sunlight and salt water around the world. North Africa and South Africa are very obvious places to look to start developing this sort of thing. And other crops can be grown. They're looking already at capsicums, cucumbers, and a few other varieties. So is it possible that this can be replicated fast enough, that we can start generating these new means of food production to feed a population of 9 billion from land that currently nobody wants and is not very productive? I think there really is a great possibility there. And we should take a pat on the back as Australians about this. You know where the funding came from for this initiative was from the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. that organisation that the Prime Minister not so long ago vanished wanted to get rid of. It's such a successful investment by the CEFC, incidentally, that private capital's taken over now and the government's got its money back and is investing in other green and sustainable initiatives. So I think that is extraordinary. So let's look at the other great juggernaut now. Population, I think, is important, but I do believe the population issue is manageable. The climate issue is, I think, more formidable. Just 3 months ago, we all probably heard of the news that an agreement was reached in Paris to limit greenhouse gas emissions at a level, as the communiqué said, well below the 2-degree safety rail that previous meetings of politicians had agreed that the temperature should not be allowed to rise beyond. That 2-degree safety rail, incidentally, in terms of science, is not really a well-supported benchmark. We know that at 2 degrees, the Greenland ice cap is going to be threatened with total melting. We know there'll be a lot of adverse changes. So to see the Paris meeting establish that the goal is to limit greenhouse gas emissions well below that 2 degrees is, I think, very, very important. In fact, the communiqué, the text, mentioned in a few places the 1.5 degree benchmark, which is much closer to a safe level. So that was a very good thing indeed. The enabling mechanism that allowed that, or gives me hope that that might be reached in part, is a new review process for this agreement. The review process begins in 2018, and that is really important because the actual actions that countries are committing to or committed to at the Paris meeting won't begin till 2020. And we all know that the plans that have been put forward thus far are manifestly inadequate to meet the ambition that the target presents us. So it's great to see a review process beginning in 2018 where new technologies, new ways of thinking, new ambition can be brought to the table and hopefully lower the greenhouse gas emissions and bring us down well below 2 degrees, as said in the communiqué. We can see some of the other trends that will help us do that. The cost advantage of renewable energy is just growing year by year, day by day. The cost of solar panels has been declining 10% per annum for the last 30 years. It's now cost competitive with conventional energy across many areas of the planet where there's high insolation or high rates of sunlight, high constancy of sunlight. In fact, I was in the US late last year and an auction was held to sell electricity in Texas. Surprisingly, the auction was won by a solar panel unit that beat gas and beat wind to the power purchase agreement. Something like 4.7 cents a kilowatt, ridiculously cheap, just because of the cost efficiencies of solar. Wind is also coming down in cost very, very fast. The big wind producers are going through a revolution now where it's no longer a bespoke industry as it was. It's now a mass manufacturing, much like making motor vehicles. The vision for wind turbines in the future is that they'll all be delivered in shipping containers, every bit of them. They'll be gearless wind turbines, so there won't be gears, there won't be mechanisms that need to be serviced all the time. They'll be very, very large. The blades themselves will be kept sharp by 3D printers that are going to be running up and down along the edge of the blades. So lower maintenance, lower installation costs, and lower servicing requirements just means cheaper energy. Some big companies are thinking that in the next 5 years, the cost of electricity from wind will drop by about half. So big changes ahead of us. Electric vehicles are another area that I think offer great hope for us. We all seem to have been talking for years about electric vehicles. I imagine it kind of feels like the horse and buggy era where everyone was talking about those T-model Fords and there wasn't many on the roads, and then all of a sudden one day there was a lot on the roads. I think that's going to happen with electric vehicles, maybe even with driverless electric vehicles. All of the big companies, the big auto companies, are putting a lot of money into EVs. And they are transformative in more ways than one. They don't just drive down the demand for oil, they also act as backup storage in the grid, or they can act as backup storage in the grid for electricity, again changing the dynamics right across the power sector. Those trends together, but particularly the the declining cost of renewables have completely changed investment in the energy sector just in the last few years. Last year, in fact, total investment in energy in terms of renewables, and this is excluding large-scale hydro, so just the wind and solar and those sort of things, was 48%, nearly half of all new investment. You know, these figures are changing year by year, and year by year we see the fossil fuels being edged out of the market. I really do think that we are in the midst of a great transition in this area. It's hard for us to see because it's happening at what seems to be a slow pace, but you look back just 5 years and see what's happened, and the changes are absolutely phenomenal. I think 5 years, 10 years from now, we'll be living in a very, very different world. And that is all good news. It all means that the technology is helping us to achieve those commitments that the world has given itself in Paris. But we face a similar problem in the climate area to what we face in the population area. It's a legacy problem. The sad fact is that for the last decade, we have been pumping out greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at the worst case scenario rate. So this was the worst rate that the scientists could have imagined back in 2001. Last year, we put about 50 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere, an absolutely staggering volume. I find it hard to comprehend 1 gigaton, much less 50, as I'm sure everyone in the audience does. But there's one way of thinking about it that may give you some sense of how much gas that represents. You know, if you think about taking 5 gigatons of CO2 out of the atmosphere, so let's imagine taking 10% of what we put in every year back into Earth's systems. How many trees would you need to plant to do that? It turns out that to take just 5 gigatons out, you'd need to plant an area larger than Australia in forest to take out 1/10 of what we're currently putting through the burning of fossil fuels. These are staggeringly large volumes. And that decade of lost opportunity, as I think about it, the sort of Bush-Abbott-Harper era, is going to resonate with us, sadly, for many, many years to come. The sad fact is that temperatures are at 1 degree Celsius above the pre-industrial average this year, but there's enough gas in the air already, in all probability, to drive global temperatures to 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial background by 2050, even if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases right now, even if we just went cold turkey on the whole thing. There's still enough gas in the air to do that. So it is very difficult to imagine how we can achieve 1.5 degrees of warming. Let's hope we can achieve 2 degrees, or to keep the limit well below 2 degrees. But I think that even that challenge is going to be extremely difficult, given the inertia in the energy system, unless we have a total change of heart. And as David has told us, unless we can see things differently, see our values differently, see what's important to us in the true sense, unless we can do that, I think it is going to be very hard to retire all of those old investments in coal-fired power plants and in oil exploration and gas. My God, we've just gone through a gas boom that's made the gold rush look like a kind of a sustainable venture, I think. But anyway, we'll get onto that later. But we have to make that change. In my latest book, Atmosphere of Hope, I argue that really if we want to have a fair chance at staying below 2 degrees, we'll need to do 2 things at once. One is to keep on slamming down on emission sources as hard and fast as we can, to close down those old coal-fired power plants in the Latrobe Valley and the Hunter Valley that are killing people year after year. I mean, I still find it unbelievable that we actually subject people to lung cancer and cardiovascular diseases just to keep those lights on. How fair is that? Is that the society we want to be part of? We know there are better ways of doing it than having people in hospital and dying by the hundreds or probably thousands in those areas where we generate our electricity. I just think it's utterly wrong, and we need to change it. Sorry for a digression there, but... Beyond that, we need, I think, to look at a new basis for our economic activity, and that basis has to be, in part, drawing some of the greenhouse gases out of the air. And there are ways of doing that, we know that. We can plant trees, it's a great example, and it's the sort of thing that we know how to do very well. Trees that can yield carbon dioxide, they take CO2 out of the air and store it somewhere, at least for time, store it safely. The example I gave, though, of how much planting you need to do to pull out 5 gigatons tells you that trees aren't going to get us to where we need to go. We'll need other mechanisms. One of those, very interestingly, is possibilities, at least, is seaweed farming. You know, there's one desktop study that said or suggested that if you planted 9% of the world's oceans in kelp farms, you could draw down the equivalent of all of the current emissions and grow enough high-quality protein in the form of fish to give every head of population on the planet 200 kilograms of fish a year. Now, I thought that was fantastic when I read about it. I know kelp grows fast, 30 to 60 times faster than land-based plants, but I had no idea that those sort of figures were possible. Then I did the calculation of how much 9% of the world's oceans are. And unfortunately, it's pretty big. It's about 4.5 times the area of Australia. But even if we do 2%, that's pretty good, huh? There's already 500 kilometre square seaweed farms off the coast of China. They buffer the oceans, they deacidify the oceans, they're excellent breeding grounds for all sorts of marine creatures that we may want to use as food. I think kelp farming has got a great future. And if we can sequester the carbon in the kelp by using pyrolysis, and there's people at Melbourne University actually doing that research right now, how do you pyrolyse kelp? How do you form it into a char that you can then store somewhere or put into the ocean? That would be a great outcome. There are other pathways as well. Silicate rocks are part of the Earth's natural system for drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere. As they weather, they draw CO2 out of the atmosphere. If we can mine and grind up silicate rocks, which are abundant in the Earth's crust, and strew them on beaches or in parks or whatever, where they can weather, we can draw the CO2 down faster. 5 or 6 gigatons of silicate rock can draw down 3 or 4 gigatons of CO2. Of course, we'd need to do all of that quarrying and grinding up without using any fossil fuels. At the moment, we can't really do that, at least at scale. But the possibility is there as we green our grid that we may be able to. There's the most extraordinary work happening around the world now in terms of just using CO2 for different things. People are making plastics out of atmospheric CO2. It's expensive these days to do that. But as the thing grows, it gets cheaper. There are people, in fact, a big breakthrough just announced from the University of Washington, who can make carbon fibres from atmospheric CO2 at a fraction of the cost of current production methods. Can you imagine what that means? Carbon fibres, the stuff that's lighter and stronger than any other material. It's a great competitor for aluminium and steel, both highly polluting industries. Can you imagine if you could make that stuff out of atmospheric carbon dioxide, the very root cause of the problem we're facing? What that might mean to us. These are revolutionary changes, I think. They are huge changes that the young people in this audience have a chance of participating in. None of us know whether any of these technologies are going to work out over the long term, but there's enough options out there, I think, to give us hope that we could have a portfolio of options that by 2050 could be drawing as much as 40% of current emissions out of the atmosphere. That's very close to 1 part per million of atmospheric concentrations of CO2. So before the Industrial Revolution, there was about 280 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. There'll be something like 450 parts by 2050, or somewhere between 400 and 450 parts, if we're lucky. So that's about, what is it, 100, someone can do the calculation for me, 300, 200, more than 200 parts per million to go, so 200 years to go at that rate. But the problem that we're facing was 200 years in the making, yeah? The climate problem started with the Industrial Revolution, it's got to where it is today. Any solutions are going to be somewhat long-term. They have to be transformative. The problem is at such a scale now that we need to bend our will as a species to forging the solutions. They're being done at a small scale now, but we need much more effort. If I was to have a kind of a recipe for success for a place like Australia, I would say get rid of the old polluting plant first of all and get yourself on the forefront of innovation. The $1 billion innovation fund we've got at the moment is great, but I tell you, we need something more like $5 billion if we really want to take advantage of this transformative new economy that is our one great hope for avoiding a climate catastrophe. Thank you very much.